Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the keynote speaker for Day 3 of the ICOS. Mr. Samuel Anim, Government Statistician of Ghana Statistical Service, has been leading GSS's transformative agenda for modernizing statistical production, establishing a quality assurance framework, and ensuring organizational agility against rapidly changing economic and social environment. During the COVID-19 pandemic, GSS, under Mr. Anim's leadership, escalated their efforts in providing relevant data by conducting 3 surveys to track the effect of COVID-19 on businesses, the local economy, and households and jobs. In 2021, the first digital population and housing census has been implemented. Mr. Anim shared his insights in this pre-recorded keynote speech, so please turn your attention to this video.
I have the honor to welcome all of you to the Day 3, Session 6 of the International Conference on Official Statistics. This session has the privilege to look at issues around building resilient data and statistical systems, focusing on what we've learned from the pandemic, our responses to it, and explore some new technical and financial needs that are associated with official statistics. Given the focus of our session, I make an attempt to put my presentation in 3 broad contexts, where I look at issues surrounding the characterization of what we mean by resilience, the current discourses around statistical systems and the use of statistical data. We try to draw a distinction between statistics and data and statistical data. The second area of my concentration will be to tell the story of Ghana during the pandemic and the interventions that we put in place to prove the concept of being resilient and how to respond to pandemics. And I would end off my speech with some takeaways that we all would want to reflect on it moving forward. By way of characterizing resilience, I make an attempt to put it in 7 broad contexts. To begin with, it's important we appreciate the fact that there are 2 extreme ends to resilience. One that I characterize it as an ex post consideration, and the other that I characterize it as an ex ante consideration. And what I mean by these 2 characterizations of resilience is, once you do not prepare for it and it occurs, your reflections would be on how do I address the occurrence of an adverse shock that was not anticipated. And once you prepare for it and you have systems that you put in place for any kind of adverse shock, we treat resilience from an ex ante perspective. The third area that I put emphasis on in characterization of resilience has to do with understanding your modes of operations and variations in your performance in the event of the occurrence of an adverse shock. Once you are putting in place this consideration, 2 things should come to mind. Whether you've reached an optimal stage of your operations, i.e. if you're a National Statistical Office, whether your dispensations are in tune with the expectations as per your Statistical Service law or what your functions mandate you to do. And the fourth area for consideration is the speed of recovery. That is, the characterization of resilience is the speed of recovery. So it's not just the occurrence of an adverse shock, but what is critical here is that you had reached a steady state of performance and there is an adverse shock, and the concern is how fast am I going to recover? And once you're thinking about how fast you're going to recover, then the 5th issue kicks in, which has to do with the mitigation of the risk and the coping strategies. And here what you need to think about is, what interventions are you putting in place? What are the synergies of the interventions that are being put in place, i.e. within your national statistical system, within your National Statistical Office, and within the broad economy? And then finally, you think about the timing of the interventions. So mitigating the risk in an attempt to ensure that you speedily get out of the adverse shock that has occurred will rely on 3 things, i.e. the interventions that you are putting in place, the synergies across the interventions, and the timing of the interventions. As a statistical agency, we need to prepare ourselves beyond just putting across statistical data once we are thinking about the characterization of resilience. And I strongly hold the view that we should make an attempt to internally assess the adverse shock or the pandemic from, again, 3 perspectives. What is your desired and your previous state of operations prior to the occurrence of the shock? What is your mode and state of operations after the occurrence of the shock? And once the interventions have been in place, you do an assessment of the mode and state of operations after the interventions have been put in place. And this will not have to be done only within the National Statistical System as an isolated organization, but in the broad context of how the country is responding to the pandemic. Having gone through this, I tried to make an attempt to look at the 2 other areas that are reflected in the theme for our session, which has to do with the national discourse on data, statistics, statistical data, and systems. All of us as national statistical offices or operators within the national statistical system, our core concern has surrounded the issues of generation, use, and storage of statistics and data for that matter. It is important to advance that conversation to where we're thinking about interoperability within the national statistical system and between the policy environment and the national statistical system. And here, once we are talking about digitization, the conversations around data, statistics, statistical systems should move beyond generation, use, and storage, and as I indicated, to begin to focus on the digital systems that have been instituted to ensure interoperability, 1, across data, and 2, between data and policy that is being made. And we in Ghana, some attempts are being made to ensure that this is tracked on a regular basis to prop up the use of data. And thirdly, what I put emphasis on the discourse around data, statistics, statistical system, is the whole concept of proving that statistics is the only way. And in times that I've advised on this matter, I place emphasis on what national statistical offices should begin to do, and they have to prove the concept that if you do not use data, these are the consequences. And this is pretty much different from showing the benefits of using data. What I'm putting emphasis on here is proving the concept of the consequences of not using data. And then the third area, which is reflected in our theme for this session, has to do with new technical and financial needs and the next steps. Indeed, I say little about this third area in the sense that I'm pretty much convinced that we really have revolutionized statistics, statistical systems, and data, both on a global scale and on a national scale. And now there are new platforms by which all of us are engaging from an international point of view. And I take this opportunity to highlight the last 4 fundamental principles of quality data, which has to do with obliging with international standards, making sure that you have international collaborations, and making sure that what you do fits into the overall framework of what is expected of you as a national statistical system. So there is a good leverage for us to benefit from bilateral engagement and also multilateral engagement. And that is precisely what Ghana Statistical Service in the last 2 years has been focusing on. On the front of financial needs, I am also pretty optimistic that we need not to look far, in the sense that statistical offices should rise beyond the concern that we do not have resources to run our organizations, simply from the perspective that data is the new oil, because we need evidence to direct our investment. And here I touch on some innovative ways that some statistical offices are putting in place to ensure that they raise resources to run their own engagement. One is what Statistics Canada is doing with its census data. If you go on their website, they're creating a hub for small enterprises on how to use the census data to place their industries to make decisions on investment. And this is the thinking that as statistical organizations we should begin to avert our minds to, on how internally we can raise resources. In any case, on the global scale, resources are being sought for to ensure that NSOs that are in deprived countries can raise themselves up to a certain level to ensure that they can meet what is required. So here I tell the story of Ghana Statistical Service from 3 perspectives: within the National Statistical Office, beyond the National Statistical Office, but within the country. Therefore, we are thinking about within the National Statistical System. And lastly, I put emphasis on our international engagement. Within the National Statistical System, what we did during the pandemic, again, is to look at it from our expectations from the state point of view, our institutional responsiveness, and also what we did during the pandemic. Like a number of national statistical offices, we did roll out 3 rapid trackers, 1 tracker in business surveys, another tracker in household survey, and the 3rd tracker from the local economy point of view. We did put a dashboard to monitor the infection rate and also identified indicators that would precipitate the severity of the infection, i.e. areas where smoking was dominant, i.e. areas where they were not obliging with the hygienic practices. So you found on our dashboard these information to help government make a decision on where the intervention should be focused. And also through other means, we engage the public, one from an opinion point of view on how we think the pandemic would rise, plateau, and if it's going to dip, it does. So from a statistical agency, we really were proactive in the kind of things that we had to do to ensure that the pandemic is abated. And again, from the national point of view, we got the National COVID Response Team and the Ministry of Finance falling on the Ghana Statistical Service for data to ensure that the policies that are put in place align with what we do. What is more important, which I want to put emphasis on, is proving resilience during a pandemic. And what I mean by proving resilience during a pandemic is not relenting on your national statistical releases, i.e. the inflation, the national account, and thankfully we obliged to release all our scheduled core national statistics, i.e. inflation and national accounts. What is more important, which I want to emphasize on, is other national activities that rarely occur, such as the censuses and the fact that you are able to hold yourself in a manner that you don't relent your preparation in the event of a pandemic. So throughout the pandemic, we continue to put in interventions that would continuously help us prepare for the census, and thankfully we've done our 2021 population housing census. Data collection has ended, and currently we are doing field clearance to ensure that within 3 months since the data collection ended, we're going to put up our preliminary results. So we've proved the concept of resilience to a point that even in the face of pandemic, Ghana is one of the countries that have been able to do not just a census, but its first fully digital census and also an in-person census, which pose a high risk amid COVID-19 and the associated consequences. The second area in the storytelling is our external engagement within the national statistical system. And again, here we're talking about harmonization within the among the various ministries, departments, and agencies that produce statistics, that use statistics, and that store statistics. And what we are putting emphasis here is lobbying to an extent that would make the National Statistical Office indeed the coordinator within the national statistical system. And what I mean by lobbying here is that you get higher state agencies that would bring the key players together to ensure that they adhere to what their respective mandate is in a way that statistics is coordinated in the country. So 2 things that we did was to get the Vice President's office to bring to the table some key agencies, i.e. the National Identification System, the Ghana Immigration System, the Birth and Death Registry in Ghana. Since as a country, amid COVID-19, we kept asking ourselves, are we going to continue to collect data in the traditional way, or are we going to drift to the non-traditional data sources, which is the order of the day? So we're working towards a transition to administrative data. For that reason, we had that higher governmental coordination to bring these institutions together to properly think through a scheme where we can harmonize our statistical processes. So fortunately, prior to the pandemic, we had started some we had resorted to some non-traditional data sources, i.e. we're heavily involved in the call detail records, which we used extensively during the pandemic to look at mobility and how infection rates are panning out. We're using our citizens-generated data to capture data from the perspective of domestic violence and waste. We're using big data in different respects to ensure that we get a better understanding of what is happening within the national statistical system. So we were more or less prepared in several perspectives ahead of the pandemic, especially at a time that as a statistical agency, just within a year of the pandemic, our new law had been passed. We had just launched our corporate plan for the period 2020 to 2024. We had gotten onto the harmonization project in West Africa, which is being funded by the World Bank. We had done a staff satisfaction survey. We had developed a document on competency framework. So just ahead of the pandemic, within the organization, there were quite a number of interventions that were in place and that had made the organization more recognizable, more useful within the economy. So it sort of set the pace for us to make ourselves more relevant during the pandemic. And it's worth mentioning that all these were made possible because we had harnessed quite a number of bilateral and multilateral collaborations, i.e. having some informal relationships with institutions such as the Kenya Bureau of Statistics, such as Statistics Rwanda, and also some formal relationships with the Office of the National Statistics in the UK, Statistics Denmark, and Statistics Norway. And from the multilateral point of view, as I indicated, we had engagement with the United Nations Development Program that funded 2 of the 3 COVID-19 trackers. We had engagement with World Bank, which I talked about earlier on the harmonization and improving statistics in West African project, and also ongoing collaboration with UNICEF, which partly funded the COVID-19 tracker on household survey. So on the multilateral front, we had quite a number of interventions that were going on ahead of the pandemic that put us in place. And this is the ex-ante dimension that I talked about earlier on in terms of the characterization of resilience. I would end off my presentation with 3 takeaways, and the first takeaway is accepting and getting to the recognition and making others aware that data is the only way to go. And from my point of view, if you want to do this, there are 2 things that you need to do. As I indicated, you need to prove the concept of the implications of not using data. So in the event where something happens and there's no data to say that we did not see it coming, that is the cost that I'm talking about, and we should be able to not qualitatively talk about it, but put some financial cost to it and say that if we had had data, this would have been the implications. So one of the things that we did ahead of the census is to put out there how the census would have given us data in a way that in the event of the COVID-19, all the stimulus packages that were going to households, we could have done that in a way that it wouldn't be on ad hoc basis. So we made an attempt to provide the unit cost of an indicator for the census, and also making a case that moving forward, we don't have to wait decennially to do the census, but getting into the hybrid of using administrative and other big data sources to provide some information on areas where we can easily intervene with data in the event of pandemic. So now there's a conversation around bringing all the telcos together to see how we can use that rich big data source to inform where we need to put our resources in the event of a pandemic. And lastly, my takeaway message is sustaining this proof of concept. So it's not just a matter of doing it once, but it's a matter of doing it regularly, because you need to look at it from multiple perspectives. As I said, it's just one perspective looking at it in the event of a pandemic, but in all other policy areas, we need to sustain the proving of the concept that if we do not use data, these are the consequences. Thank you very much.